disasters and what governments can do to build up resilience and better plan for disruptive events. And to present the report, we have Margareta Wallström, Special Representative of the UN Secretary General on Disaster Risk Reduction. We have Rolf Alter, Director of Public Governance and Territorial Development at the OECD. Cyril de Montgolfier, Senior Vice President, European and Public Affairs at AXA. Alex Wittenberg, Managing Partner, Global Head of Corporate Risk at Oliver Wyman.
Thank you. Thank you very much for joining us here to a very important event for the risk community, and I dare say the risk community around the globe. This morning, for those of you who were with the Secretary General and the Prime Minister of Slovenia and the head of the economic advisors of President Obama, will have heard a lot of references to resilience and inclusive growth. Resilience not only is the topic of our ministerial meeting here tomorrow and the day after, it is also actually a concept that we in the risk community like a lot and have endorsed a while ago. What we present here today is a book which is called Boosting Resilience Through Innovative Risk Governance, and I am very pleased that we have next to me here Madame Margareta Wallström, who will surely make a few comments on the international perspective. Cyril de Montgolfier from AXA, looking at, I guess, the importance and the implications of our work on resilience for the industry, but also for the citizens and the customers and clients. But I'll assure you, you will take care of your intervention yourself. And then, of course, we have Alex Wittenberg, the representative of Wyman from, what would I say, for a very well-known advisor to the private sector, how to get themselves resilient. Let me just say that it's a pleasure, but it's also indicative. These participants at the launch today, very indicative for what we would like to achieve. First of all, I think we will really like to make sure the government is understood as a major actor when it comes to risk management at national and international level. And I say with emphasis, one actor. It's not the only one, and no risk policy in the world could be based exclusively on action by governments. Nevertheless, let me just rest there for a second and say, tomorrow, the ministers of the ministerial meeting here will endorse something which is called the Recommendation of the Council on the Governance of Critical Risks. This is a recommendation to governments, and it says what, in the view of our high-level risk forum in the OECD, governments need to do good risk management policies. So the first here is this address to governments tomorrow, endorsed by ministers. Second, very clearly, if you talk about governance and effective risk management, you need the other actors on board. And that is, of course, the communities, the individuals, the citizens, and, of course, the private sector. What we're trying to do here is to say, what are good institutional setups to bring these people together to make the world a little more resilient. Resilient for what? Resilient for ensuring that there is economic growth, that there is economic opportunity, that there is social access, and there is in a way that's what we would here call in the OECD Better Lives Action. So there is quite an ambitious program, a number of very important actors with me here today at the table, and I'd like just to say we want to start with Madame Wallström from the UN to give us perhaps a bit of a perspective from what's going on in the wider world than the OECD. Margaret.
Thank you so much. And of course, the wider world has a very big chunk of OECD in it these days. So that it's very important what is happening in OECD. Globally, in fact, I always like to say that for more than 40 years, risk has been on the agenda of United Nations, disaster risk, because scientists could already then see that the accumulation, the fast accumulation of risk would begin to have very serious impact on countries' economies. Not because of the disaster, but because of the socio-economic growth and the development, the way society develops. And that's where we are now after 40 years. Internationally, we do have a voluntary framework for collaboration called the Euro Framework for Action, HFA, and the significance of that today is that in March next year, we are going to the third World Conference for Disaster Risk Reduction for a updating and renewal of this risk management framework in the perspective of what's happened over the past 10 years. What have countries learned? What conclusions do they draw for this? And what is required to manage risk widely around the world? In the past 10 years, there are just two big things that have happened. There are many things that have happened, but in this domain, some that have changed critically. One is that the perception, and that was a very strong perception, that disasters was a problem for poor countries. It's now completely been reversed. Disasters is a very huge problem for the richest part of the world, and I think this is the work that OECD is doing, and really opening up this conversation and demonstrating what it means in economic, social, and in fact political and stability terms. And the second big risk is that due to some of the major catastrophic events in the past 6 to 8 years, the business sector and the private sector have probably gained a lot more understanding of how they are linked to this domain of risks. Because if you just remember, have you seen how risk traveled through the global supply chain? A little bit less visibly, but increasingly equally important, how risk travels through the international financial architecture, and how the international financial architecture actually can decide whether we have a more resilient future or not. So our engagement with the business sector is because without engaging with the business sector, we cannot, in fact, aim to achieve the resilience that could come out of the key issues here. So the transboundary nature of disasters and disaster risk is so strong. And it's not just in physical terms, it's in architectural or financial terms, it's in political impact, it's on people moving, it's migration issue. I see you have several events here on migration. But just think about it as transboundary in geographical physical terms. Shared water basins, shared underground water resources, impacting availability of water, agriculture, impacting certification. Second big aspect is, of course, the technical capacity of countries to manage risk. I can report to you that, in fact, over the past 10 years, a significant capability has been built in most countries in the world to respond to disasters and to understand the policy imperatives and what are the key issues. A few challenges around what we hope we can address together over the coming years. Information sharing. I would say information availability and access, because being available is not the same thing as being accessible. So what is it? One, it's still the reality that some countries hesitate to share their data, but it's also just how do you process the data, because you just sit down with your computer and you get overwhelmed by the information. So where do you find really, let's say, solid data that you can trust? And where are the risk models in where the risk modeling is actually a free market offer? Who can tell you what's an appropriate risk model for you? So there are lots of issues around decision-making, accountability. So this way that risks are now traveling through the global system will be one of the key issues for us in the next year, and leading up to that, because we are now obviously working together to identify what are key issues. And above all, that's really what we spend most of our time on, try to get sort of to the surface what countries have learned, what have they managed to achieve, and how do we use that to lay the foundations for the next 20-25 years risk management. And part of that is the enormous work. If I may, I will congratulate OECD for this report. It's not really the job, it's not in my talking points, but just reading it, it's such a solid compilation and analysis of all the critical issues that lie ahead. So I'm sure this will be important for OECD, but it will have importance beyond OECD. And we are, as you can imagine, working with the OECD, the team here and the many members, also to bring this knowledge and these conclusions that you've already drawn about the direction forward to the World Conference next year and to the preparatory work for the World Conference. It's very clear that unless one little terminology that I picked up not long ago in one of the European countries is policy-induced risks. It's the risks that we create by not ensuring that we have policy coherence. Good intentions, you try to fix one thing, you try to fix one here, and you end up actually creating a new risk in the territory between them. I think that's one of the critical challenges for many now. And as you look at the global system, 2015 is a rather special year. We got 3 important global agendas, hopefully reaching an outcome. The World Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction is in March, early in the year, in Sendai City in Japan. After that, the same world community, more or less, will go to New York to decide on the Sustainable Development Agenda. And then almost the same community will go to Paris to decide on a climate framework. Now, as complicated as this may sound, I look at this as an enormous opportunity, because of course the development agenda, without the foundations of reducing and managing risks and managing the climate as a risk, is unlikely to be as visionary and sustainable as we are all aiming to do. So that's where I see this cooperation and where this fits in, and OECD's important work in all these areas, but this is what I think, of course, will have a critical impact on the work that we do for next year. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Margaret. It's, it really, as you can see, it's a fantastic partner to have when you want to work on some issue that, in fact, is not just a complex, but it's a global issue. Therefore, I think we making here a contribution, and we are glad that we have Margaret with us today and also for the next while. 2015, 3 key events. I must admit that also the timing has been very seductive and seductive for us to get our work ready. Then I would like to ask Cyril de Montgolfier. AXA is a partner in our high-level risk forum from the beginning. We established it 3 years ago. We're delighted to have you with us here today, and perhaps may I invite you to make a few comments on this issue.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. And that's true, it's a great opportunity, and as said by Margaret, what is really interesting is to see that the number of collaboration between private sector and public sectors is really increasing. I think it's a global trend, not only in our topic, and that's something we absolutely must have in mind. That means the period where we had the companies producing, the state deciding, the consumer consuming, and so on and so forth, it is really the past. Now we see that all these types of partnerships are more and more important. That means all together we have to co-decide what the future will be. And I think that the topic we have today is probably one of the best examples we may have to see how it can work in the future, and that's really the point. Having said that, that means that each actor must really focus on its added value. That means where can we differentiate ourselves and I would say help the global solution we'll have in the future. And I think it's really what we think as a private sector and as an insurance industry to be as efficient as possible for the future of the world. So the first thing we can say, and we all know that, is that the private sector plays several key roles in providing risk reduction measures to increase the resilience of economies and societies. That's obvious, but I think it's important to know and to think about what it concretely means for the future. The third thing is that the private sector provides concrete solutions in terms of risk reduction measures that can be purchased by other actors or markets. That means there are solutions, there are services, there are products that can be purchased by others, and I think that's true in terms of infrastructures, of course, that's true in terms of technology. I would say that's true, obviously, for the future. The second point is that it's also, for the private sector, it has to protect its own business, which is obviously our key role also. That means we have to protect our business from being disrupted when disasters occur. That means, of course, that's something we must have in mind. The third point, which is obviously important to us, is that the private sector, has to be a key partner of the government in its role of providing critical infrastructure. That means we have to create the ways of these partnerships with the different governments. And having said that, we also must recognize that we have a lot to gain from public authorities, of course, in terms of expertise in the way to manage cities, regions, and so on. That means we have all the means to have a win-win solution, means win for the governments and public actors, win for the private sector. And I think that really is the basis we must have in mind to make sure that on the long term it will provide very, I would say, powerful solution. And that's really the first reason explaining the involvement of AXA in this topic. That means we have to create, to identify our added value, and then to, I would say, create the basis of this win-win solution. But to be honest, as far now, the exchange of information about existing risks has been limited between private sector and government. That means we have to do it for the future, and we cannot say that we have been extremely successful in the past. So, what governments could do to answer directly your question? The first thing is that governments can and probably should collaborate with the private sector, and we have also to push the government to do it, especially where mutual benefits and economies of scale can be achieved. Businesses are the art of restoring economies after disaster occur. So that's really a first point which, from our perspective, is very key. The second thing that governments could do is governments should encourage the provision of crucial risk reduction technologies. That means the role of regulation to favor these new technologies are extremely important. We see it today in Europe, with for instance, in insurance, with Solvency II delegated acts. There is a very concrete example about long-term financing. What about infrastructures? How do we favor the financing by insurance for the future of economy? And that's extremely concrete, and we will see, I would say, in the coming days or weeks, in the draft we'll have from the EU, that if the new regulation will really encourage this type of investments on Earth. The third thing is that governments and the private sector should seek to maximize and incentivize further information exchange. That's absolutely critical. So perhaps a few words to go more into details about the insurance industry. What's our business? At the end, the business of an insurance company is really to manage data. That's really our role. We do it every day. And that's the way for us to understand the new risks, to understand what will happen in the future. And of course, the second part of our job is to be on a daily basis with our clients, and to be with our clients at a very, very critical moment very often, and that's obviously the case in our example. Having said that, we think that there are three areas where we could really, I would say, help and differentiate ourselves and really add value in the current debate. The first is about the research, and the research about new risks. As we see, we know that our business is to manage this data for new risks. The first thing we have to do is to anticipate, to understand these risks we will have in the future. Just as an example, we have done with AXA, we financed through what we have called the AXA Research Fund, 100 million euro during the past 3 years to just finance research. It's not an AXA research, it's a research done by the best academics and the scientists in the world. And we have decided to renew this 100 million euro for the coming 3 years. It's a huge investment. And a third of this investment is about climate risk. So that really saying, it's our role, it's our job to do it. And once again, not only for us, means for the common good in the future. The second thing the area where we think we can differentiate ourselves is about prevention, risk management. It's really, once again, when you have a very, very tough situation, what we think is the insurance company will pay. Of course, it's part of our job, of course. But more important than that is to prevent. That means to avoid. And that's really something we have done for years. And risk management is definitely at the core of an insurance company business every day. And we are sure that combining, for instance, the knowledge of government to manage cities, regions, and so on, and our knowledge about risk management is something where we should really do nice things in the future. Once again, that's our job, and we have to do it probably in a better way in these kind of private-public partnerships in the future. The third area is obviously about products. That means what kind of products will we offer in the future to our clients, on the retail side, but also on the commercial line side. And that's true in terms of insurance product, but also in terms of investment policy. We are investors. We are long-term players and long-term investors. How do we see in our policy the commitment we should have, probably, to make sure that this topic, that means we will help the topic be solved in the future. What are the solutions we can improve? So that's 3 ideas we have, and we are more than happy to share these ideas with Margareta's team, I would say on a daily or weekly basis. Once again, we have to create these partnerships. We have to know each other probably better, to identify the new areas where we can solve the future. And once again, we think that doing that will definitely be more efficient.
Thank you very much. And then Alex, please feel free to talk about the business sector.
Great, thanks, Rolf. I always get nervous because of these kind of things. Rolf always allows me to represent the entire business sector, and that seems to be somewhat daunting. I'm not sure that they necessarily would have selected me. That said, I think a couple of things I'm just going to say before we get started. In my role, what we really do is work with large corporates, both financial services firms and industrial corporates. And we work on risk to their enterprise, and frankly, as a firm, we're agnostic to solutions. So we're really interested in trying to come up with the most efficient way for large corporates to deal with risk. And so you might want to think, why am I here talking at this kind of forum? But in most of our work, we'll find that 3 things come up in most corporates' top 10 issues they're most concerned about. One is regulatory uncertainty, second is political change, and the third is the fiscal capacity of governments to deal with these events should they occur. And frankly, if that's coming up inside of our client base, I think it certainly points in a very real way, not just to how governments think there should be private-public partnerships, but indeed how corporations think that there's a role for government in how they manage risk on a day-to-day basis as well. So you might want to take that as a backdrop to my remarks. A few years ago, the OECD issued a major report called Future Global Shocks, and we worked on that report with Rolf and some of the other folks here. The paper really talked about a clear need to better anticipate and manage major risks, exposed the increased complexity of potential events and the scale of the damage, and provided an impetus to governments, industry, and other parties in how they might better be addressed. This particular report that's out now on resilience that's launched today, and the set of recommendations on governance of critical risk that Rolf referenced that are being launched later in the week, I think strengthens the case for action and identifies some tangible initiatives to strengthen resilience at national and international levels. And while policymakers may be the primary target of these new papers, it is clear they cannot address all the risks by themselves. Private sector enterprises also play an essential role in ensuring ongoing economic activity and human safety in forecasting unwelcome scenarios and in responding to these types of crises. Indeed, in many countries, as well as supplying essential goods and services, the private sector actually owns and operates much of the critical infrastructure in energy, water, transportation, and telecommunications, on which a well-functioning society is going to depend both pre-crisis and certainly post-crisis. I think by thinking carefully about their exposures to large-scale events, companies can make good, rational, strategic choices. They will protect themselves financially and build robust operating environments. But it's not really just about business continuity and sustaining yourself in one of these situations. Companies large and small can also influence the behavior of citizens, as many of the citizenry, especially on a local level, are actually going to be employees of the corporate enterprises that are there. As well, they can also partner with governments in the construction and maintenance of critical infrastructure, services, and response mechanisms. Natural catastrophes, as we've seen in Japan, and certainly Superstorm Sandy in New York, man-made disasters such as the Gulf of Mexico oil spill, financial crisis, various geopolitical crises we're facing, and indeed SARS, have all presented new and unexpected challenges, not just for government, but for private sector, in terms of the robustness of their own operation and their own supply chain. And the capacity of governments to respond quickly is very important to these private sector organizations. With the continual growth in global interconnectedness and the concentration of economic activity in vulnerable locations, and frankly, the escalation of new risks such as cyber attacks on critical infrastructure, both governments and companies alike can surely expect more complex crises in the future. As today's report says, the private sector forms part of the new risk governance paradigm. That does not mean that government is going to be dumping risk that it can no longer afford onto companies. And it does not mean encouraging companies to engage in disaster relief. Instead, it means achieving a better balance of responsibilities across all parties relating to risks and rewards. And it means recognizing how solutions can be most effectively developed and implemented for the good of all. In the first instance, we need more dialogue between government and companies, an exchange of data and intelligence on trends in critical risks and emerging government priorities. Often at national and a local level, there are informational asymmetries that can be redressed without any breach of national security or commercial confidentiality. And I'll give you a quick example. At this particular organization, I listened to one country describe their top 10 risks. And it was done in confidence, so I won't say who it was. But they, post-Macondo, identified offshore oil spill as one of their top 5 that they were really concerned about. And I was thinking about my own client base, and I realized one of my clients was going to be the source of that risk if that actually happened. And when I talked to my client, they had not engaged with that country's risk management staff to actually discuss how they were going to deal with it. And so when you start realizing how it sounds very obvious that they would have this kind, you would have this kind of dialogue and partnership. It didn't occur, and this was in what I would consider a reasonably sophisticated country. So I'll leave you with that as an example. I think dialogue and information sharing between governments and companies can encourage tactical initiatives for safeguarding people, property, and other assets. But equally important, it can also inspire more strategic initiatives. Through clear policy goals, governments can stimulate investment into valuable solution and mitigation activities. These may stimulate infrastructure and technological or alternative forms of financing for risk. Some of these innovations may have highly specific applications, others may have more widespread potential. Some may be stimulated by changes in regulations, others may need R&D investment or indeed tax incentives. Either way, governments can fulfill their duty of care towards citizens and their economies by being critical enablers as well as providing direct support or being the insurer of last resort. This is increasingly essential as we prepare ourselves for the complex challenges of the coming years. And the burden of analysis, detection, and response needs to be shared among all participants in the economy.
So we have time for any questions. If you could say who you are before you ask your question. Don't be shy. Anybody?
My question was related to information sharing with Stephanie Jacobson from OECD. We have a lot of data on this. There is a lot of lost data available around there, and there is more data than anyone can crunch. The question is, what can we do with such data? Does it exist in all sorts of forms and formats and ways that are not fully compatible? So it would be interesting to hear how can we make something out of this data, something that can be useful for the sort of collaboration that people were just discussing. Thank you.
I would say, I think it's, I don't want to put axe on this a lot, but I think one of the things that has to be, considered is that a lot of this data that is held by private enterprise in particular is often viewed as competitive advantage. So if you look at the insurance industry, Swiss Re holds data, Munich Re holds data, AXA holds data, they all hold data on various clients, and it is robust, very robust data. So in some respects, though, I understand the need for them to protect this from a privacy standpoint. They have clients that they expect it to be protected. But it would be useful if there was some way to have a clearinghouse for this kind of information, like an agnostic clearinghouse, someone who actually didn't care what the names were, but were more interested in what the actual values were, the exposures, the actual loss, and things like that.
Perhaps if I can just add a few words, because I think you're perfectly right, explaining the debate we may have. But I think that today is probably an old debate. That means these data will be available in any case. That means, and if it is not tomorrow, if it is not today, it will be tomorrow. That means the competitive advantage we have is in the way we use this data. That means we modelize this data. And just if I take two examples. When we have today to analyze the frequency of extreme events, for instance, in continental Europe, based on the climate change. It means we know that we have a lot of micro events increasing. We have the data. The data are available. However, what we still don't have is how do we modelize based on these data and to understand what will happen in the future, how we will increase the efficiency of our products, the advice we give to our clients, and so on and so forth. And I think it's something we have done with the team in the past months. And the question was not the availability of data. I think it's really something which is extremely critical and extremely sensitive. So that means understanding where is added value in the value chain. from my perspective, it's not just in the data.
I think one thing that we've also experienced with our clients, to follow on, is that often even when the data is available and you have it, usually questions come relatively quickly, and you need to be able to respond relatively quickly. And that tends to be more of the problem, is that if you had 2 months to analyze the data in response to a specific question from the board of directors or the government, then yeah, you get it done. But usually people expect answers much more quickly. And so to your point about how do you model it, it's not just does your model give you the right answer or give you an answer, it's going to give you one quickly enough that you can actually action it, or is the event already gone past and you just missed your opportunity?
But I actually agree with Cyril that this is a slightly old debate when it comes to the insurance industry, because I don't think that's your sales. That's not your product anymore, it's the models. I mean, we have views on the models as well, but I think the data is really, I compare to when I started in this industry of disasters, it was relatively hopeless to have a conversation with any insurance because that was the big secret. It's completely opposite now. In fact, there's a generosity of data that happening. And I think there's a whole set of other issues around data. It's really the processing of data to get it to a basis for a decision. And who takes charge of this, and what kind of bias lies behind the question and the organizing principles for the data. I think it's something we should take a lot of interest in. And thirdly, just to get to the understanding of the decision-making process, which is very much the whole area of, I think, one of the critical issues around the whole risk management. A few years ago, I came across a not so encouraging report on what you see as the typical decision makers. What do they ask for to have as a basis when they take critical decisions? If you're thinking about government officials and maybe organization officials, they very rarely ask for the best of science and good data. Why? Not because of bad will, but they are pushed to take decisions on the urgency. They are pushed to take decisions on the given fiscal constraints. So they take a decision that is very rarely, or let's say not often enough to be generous, based on all the things that are available to ensure that decisions are informed. So I think that we move from the data, which is an issue in itself, I think from an availability in the shaping of the data, but actually to the user side of the data. And that's where probably we have a very interesting period ahead of us. I want to reflect with you precisely in this spirit, and maybe this is typical for what's going on in a lot of the industry, is what is the added value of this? I met a company representative who they are given away freely the software that they have developed to develop some mysterious new compressor that issues no emissions. I mean, I don't understand it. But it's a hardware company, they say. So we give away the software because they say that's not our value anymore, even though the software, I'm sure, used to be the key to what they were really selling. So this whole transformation also, what is really the added value, I think it's important for us to understand. In order to create that conversation and dialogue between the public and the private, and undo some of the biased ideas about business and governments, mutual preconceived ideas of which there are many.
If I just may add, this recommendation is called, it's a recommendation on governance of critical risk, and governance really has not just to do something with risk management. It's a principle that we here in the OECD have and are developing mainly by the day, I would say. And there are two very important ingredients for data issues. One is, of course, the point that Margareta makes, how good are decisions when it comes to evidence-based. And there is a lot of things that can be done in governments that we definitely would know. We're trying here to provide a sort of a blueprint how that could be organized. How can that process be improved? That has a lot to do with the actors on this risk management. Very often if you go around governments, they are certainly somewhere, but very few have government people at the center to be responsible for risk management. But who else would it be if it wouldn't be the Prime Minister in a sort of picture that I think is important to maintain? Risk for government means someone manages the country's economic conditions, economic perspective, competitiveness, but of course also social and environmental aspects. So there's an issue about the institution, the way that works. But there's also a very important part of our governance here, and you would feel and see and read this in many places. It's about participation. And that's where I think private sector, public sector, civil society has to be part of this process. And this is not something at will, at best, nice to have. It's a necessity, as you just, I think, very well underlined. It is a necessity to have access to what is today knowledge and information. And how do you organize that? That's part of our recommendation here. Let me just say I was struck by an initiative that was taken by the World Economic Forum about 2 years ago. The same issue arises, of course, as Alex was saying. There is a limit to what private sector would share for simply the reasons of a competitive edge that is in that information. But there may be many things that are available today which could be very well shared if we only had the right channels, the right institutional setup, and the usefulness on the side of those who take decisions to demand for it. So there's space for it. Regulatory policies is one good example where we would apply the same principles. We are here a very strong defendant, or I'd say promoter, of risk-based regulation. There's a lot of things to be done in governments to get there. But it's part of our message here, very focused when it comes to risk management. This is where some good ideas exist, actually. And as you know, in the OECD world, there are quite a number of countries that would like to be and are ready to share their good experiences in that respect as well. That's why I'm so hopeful that this product will actually contribute to change. And if you want to know how do we monitor it, in 2 years' time we'll have to come back here to our member countries. We'll have to tell them what it is that they have done in response to this recommendation. Some countries have already gone a long way and have invited us to look at their risk management systems. And I think these are extremely valuable exercises that we carry out. I would say that our forum here, where both AXA and Oliver Wyman is part of it, shows how much openness in a confidential environment can actually be generated.
Any questions?
Martin Forst from the OECD. I mean, I understand a lot of the risk will occur on the local and regional level. So to what extent you judge are local and regional governments prepared to follow this new approach to governance of risk?
Since it's about governance, perhaps I will volunteer to say something on that. Absolutely true. You know, it's like politics and policies, they happen where people live. So in the end, it is local. It's very much local. And it is also true that capacities at local level are not always up to that level of competence that you would need for a modern risk policy approach. On the other hand, this is why I think national governments have a particular responsibility for it. On the other hand, it means that this type of risk management approach cannot be decided at national level. It had to be a collective, collaborative approach across levels of government. But I will give you an example here. Few months ago, we'll look at the risk of flooding in Paris. I mean, this is a very local area, and you would think that looks pretty straightforward. What is it that you need to put in place? But what we found was that there were, by the dozens, actors involved that had no set of collaboration or cooperation in place. How would you do and deal in such an environment with a joined up risk management approach? You need to do a lot of different things in getting the governance structures, the institutional setup right. And this is not to talk about just about the government. It was also the private sector was basically uncoordinated. And if you think still at the risk, the potential damage, we have tried to express it in loss of GDP, really significant losses that you could occur. It's worthwhile to invest in better governance and better institutional setups where private sector citizens and the local and regional governments get together. So there is a very strong point to be made about that need cannot just be a question of a capital, even if it has to be part of that setting the rules of the game.
I think we have time for just two more. One here and one there.
Sorry. Marie-Pierre Méganc, I am from the French Ministry of Ecology and responsible in risk prevention, international affair for risk prevention. And I think what you said is really the point. So you wanted a testimony from a government member. And we managing from the workshop just to think to the post-Hugo framework we are working on, and we called it globalization on major risk and what for France. And the workshop was for all the French stakeholders, because it was a French platform, public, private, local government and local power, and also the work we've done together on the Seine flood was in the debate, on the table. And I think the real problem is how we can manage, because of course the risk, the disaster itself is global, but the major risk is completely global. And I think we all together have to think how, what government to go from the local to the global, and because even in France, if our floods are not like a Philippine tsunami, if there is a Philippine tsunami, even in a local town in France, we will have consequences. And that culture of risk has to go up and down every time. And we have to find all together how to manage it. And of course, the data is a real problem, and we need to have to imagine how to collect and to share data. And I think one of the problems we have to face is we have to have very complicated data and very scientific data to share at a global level, but we have to have data which can be shared with the local power, which are the good data, and perhaps they don't need all the science background, but we have to find what sort of data which is exact, but not that complicated, can help to decide even for a measure of a little municipality. and how to have guidelines going up and down to manage that. Thank you.
Just a quick thing on that. As part of when we were working through developing these, what we started to realize too is that there's a vertical side of it, which is the local, the state, federal government, but equally there's a horizontal aspect to it as well. And I'll give you one quick example that I think illustrates this. We had a client in the United States who ran coal-fired power plants, and it was a particularly hot summer, and they were told to run them a little harder than they normally do. At which point they said, we will exceed our environmental certificate, so I can't do that. The state regulator said, we don't care, we're not having a brownout in the state. And they were promptly fined the next day by the federal regulator. So in their attempt to avoid one risk, which was massive brownouts in a very industrialized state, they actually had to assume another risk and knew perfectly well that they were going to contradict. And I think that's looking at it, not necessarily a catastrophic situation, although I dare say brownout might have been a bad thing to have happen. But you can see how these regulations, as somebody talked about the unintended consequences, I don't think anybody intended that was what was going to happen, but that is indeed what happened.
Just on this local, global, and of course the disasters we talk about and that shape our perception of the cataclysmic events are of course the really big ones, but the ones that cost most money to countries are the ones you never read about in the newspaper. That's what happens in villages and small communities. It's roads, it's bridges, it's schools, it's clinics, and there is so much of it, so it far exceeds the totality of the rest on the annual year. So why don't we know these things? Well, even though data is collected, if no one asks from the center for the data, it remains with the local government. When we started working with governments to build national disaster loss databases, historical ones, we found the most surprising countries having 100-year-old disaster data, handwritten of course, and no one had ever asked for it, so it didn't go anywhere. So this is the very concrete aspects of what data are you asking for when you take important decisions to manage your risk. So I think this whole, and there is, in fact over these years, it's not everyone understands the importance of the local, but what consequences it has when you design policies with local impact. There's been a great tendency to delegate lots of work and lots of responsibility and no money and no authority to the local. This is a bit of a global pattern, so no one is better or worse here. And of course today local governments are saying, no, it doesn't work. So every country is different, you have different administrative structure, but one thing they do have in common is that they need a much stronger locality and an inclusiveness in the policy and execution. And you talked about participation in decision making, participation in analysis and understanding of risk. But it also has to do with how institutions, of course, are shaped. Now, this is a slightly longer-term work agenda, but I don't think we can really move forward without recognizing fully that there is a capacity and a policy gap there that is going to significantly determine the resilience in 25 years.
Okay, last question.
Thank you very much. My name is John Blondell from the OECD Secretariat, and I have a question for the panel on risk transfer. And I think sort of the recent history of most countries has seen governments assuming more and more of all sorts of society's risks, perhaps because they understood the risks the least of anyone. But now with a greater appreciation in governments of the risks, coupled with the very tight fiscal situation that sort of we can see for the foreseeable future in countries, do you believe there is now a change, that now there will be a pushback with the private sector, the government trying to transfer risk back to the private sector and to society at large?
Shall I help you?
Yeah, please.
help everybody else. I think, yes, sometimes I like to call this period the biggest risk transfer in history of humankind. But there's a serious message, because it's clear that decades ago government actually paid the lesser part of all the losses. As you point out, governments have taken on more and more. I think for different reasons, political, developmental systems, and it's reached, I think, from every perspective, an unreasonable situation, both in financial terms but also in political terms. Because so there is a risk transfer, and the most public manifestation of this, I think, you started hearing it maybe 5-6 years ago after some of the big catastrophic events. The government actually says we cannot cope with all this on our own. We need citizens to take more responsibility for their own safety. Now, exactly what that meant, of course, it's not really, but I think that's a clear signal. And so the citizen-government relationship, I think, is the first one, because it has to do with the local as well. And I think many countries have learned over the past years that the cost of disasters come back fairly quickly to the tax. Several big catastrophes in the last 5 years actually have led to governments asking citizens to contribute through accepting to increase the tax burden, and civil servants cutting their salaries for a few years. So there's a very direct link between this. So it is a big change, and I think it's a change that requires also a lot more conversation between the public and the private, and a lot more understanding by the citizens on what they actually pay. Not only over their tax, but actually from their own losses, and begin to value it. Because I think one of the challenges that remain about the risk is that we don't really realize very well what it costs us, because somebody else pays all the time. Either it's the government, or it's insurance, if you've been clever enough to have one, which most of us don't. And in other ways it gets absorbed and disappears. So the true cost of disasters remains still a fairly blurred image. We know a lot more than we did 10 years ago, but we don't know enough.
Just want to say here, when you look at this transfer that you described, it actually could be simply because of ignorance about the risks. It could also be because there was an increase of complexity that governments haven't really seen, as by the way many others as well. If I take the events in Fukushima, governments were pretty much aware of the individual risk of a tsunami, of an earthquake, but they were not well suited to think about 3 of those that hit and reinforce each other. So I think there is something really about simply learning, having the insight, being aware of it. But there is a very important risk that I see, and you mentioned it, Margareta, in political terms. The fact that governments take it on without knowing it, and citizens don't know that governments taking it on, has also led to the fact that citizens trust less the capacity of governments to manage well. So it's a very unfortunate, vicious cycle. You do something because you don't know exactly, the others don't know either, but when it hits you, then they say, well, but aren't you aware or able to actually manage it? I think that we wanted here with our work also to make very clear that there is a role for private sector, not because we want them to become human good doers. No, it's for their own interest and for the own interest of citizens to be able to decide about what they would like to insure against. But for that, they have to know. And you have to have a good level of awareness of what risk exists today to take a reasonable decision on the basis of this knowledge leads me to take or not to take on an insurance. And for the private sector, I guess, this is what we have seen, at least very interesting in our wonderful forum. It is about describing, I guess, the space where individuals can take responsibility for themselves.
Just if I may complete, we know that 25% of the people having the claims after a national catastrophe last year were insured. So it means, is it an optimized situation? Probably not, but that's the truth. So that means, and more than transfers from public to private, I think that this idea of partnership, co-decision-making process is probably more true for the future. That means how will we together find a better solution for the future? Once again, 75% being not insured. And as you can imagine, it is not in the most future countries. So that means there is definitely a topic. And that this win-win situation we will find. It means not only win for government and for insurance companies, but win-win for the client at the end. So I think there is definitely a model where we have to work on.
A couple of points on this. It's certainly something that's been we've discussed for a while. I think one of the things to keep in mind when you start thinking about risk transfer is it depends on when you're trying to do it. Different countries have different fiscal profiles as well on the revenue side. And when you look at the revenue side of these individual countries, it may lend you to have one view of risk transfer during the year in which you have extremely robust revenues and nice growth in your economy and that kind of thing. And if you're having a contraction, or if you're a commodity-dependent economy and the price of that particular commodity seems to be low, risk transfer may seem a lot more attractive to you. This, again, is thinking about it ex ante as opposed to ex post, which is probably not terribly likely. So I think often we think through from a potential event standpoint, but those events, you know, an earthquake in a particular country that's got great revenues going may seem less important than when revenues are really low. So, and then to follow that through is to think through, okay, after this event, what do our revenues look like? I mean, is this something we can even sustain? So that's one point. I think the second point, and this is relative to insurance, I think the insurance industry often in this kind of forum is like, well, you know, they look at you and they look at something in Swiss Re and they say, well, why don't you guys just make more capital available? Well, when you start looking at Hurricane Sandy and realizing it's a $60 billion payout from the U.S. government, and I think they picked up about 70% of the tab on that, that's a lot of capital for one single loss. And to Margarita's point, it's not the one loss that, I mean, obviously that's a big loss for the insurance industry to sustain, but they've also got their regular volatility that they're planning for as well. So you have to start thinking, what is the capital availability, and is there some, there's some ex-ante management that has to be done. The other thing I think happens in government, and we've been thinking about that as a firm for a while, is I think there's an overemphasis or reliance on the notion of diversification. There are really two kind of principles in risk. One's concentration and one's diversification. And everybody understands risk concentrations and how they're going up from, especially when you think about economic value that's exposed to loss. But I think a lot of politicians in particular think that they have a diversification effect that's going to get them out of these kind of situations. I have a very well diversified economy. I don't have to do this. And I think in some cases it gets overemphasized. And to Rolf's point, these things are interconnected. And to think that a certain region may be well diversified, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's not susceptible to one aspect of the economy going down and taking the rest of it with it.
Thank you. I think we'll wrap things up there. Thank you very much.
Thank you.